What you've just watched is a preview of a new series, The Radium Girls. Every week in November, we'll be releasing a new episode, each one taking you deeper into their story. Episode 1 will premiere this November. And if you're watching this now, thank you for being part of our journey. When we began working on this series, we knew we had to do it right, and with an incredible voice. You've heard her in some of our other productions. Now, hear her bring the Radium Girls to life. You can also learn more about the real Radium Girls through additional resources, including a digital exhibit, accessible through the links provided. Thank you for joining us. Let the story begin. This series is more than a collaboration. It's a labor of love. A shared passion for uncovering history that has been overlooked. Radium is everywhere in this story. In the paint, in the bones, in the shadows cast by the past. You find a visual artist who can create something breathtaking. Meet Carolina. She worked closely with our team to develop the visual identity of the series, combing through historical records to ensure every detail was authentic, down to the style of dress and the very shape of the factories. We sought out experts to help us find and analyze primary sources, everything from medical journals to vintage advertisements. We wanted to see the world through the lens of science, the same way the Radium Girls once did. But telling this kind of story comes with a challenge. How do you make the unseen seen? And finally, how do you bring all of this to life? We hope you enjoy it. And if you do, please share it with friends and family. They glowed. The Radium Girls, faces bent over dials, painting numbers meant to light the darkness, glowing in the black velvet night of history. They glowed, bones green and ghostly, haunted by the very progress they had helped create. The radium that made their bones glow was the same radium that was killing them. It was in their blood. It was in their teeth. It was in their marrow, turning the insides of their bodies into ticking tombs. And as they glowed, a chilling truth dawned on the world, lower jaws eroding until their chins collapsed into their throats. It was argued that the women were sick from syphilis, from poor nutrition, from hysteria. In court, corporations used delay tactics, hired powerful lawyers, and passed blame from department to department. It was unprecedented, working-class women, sick and dying, taking on a major corporation backed by government contracts and public trust. And yet, they won. Their story became a landmark in labor rights and worker protections, while their executives thrived in comfort. The girls coughed blood in cramped tenement rooms, their lawsuits stalled by bureaucracy and greed. By 1928, their bodies were ticking down. Yet they had carved something permanent into history. Their glow, once sold as novelty, had become illumination of another kind, the truth behind industrial silence. The courtroom was not where justice was found. It was where the cost of silence was measured. Ankles twisting from the weight of mere steps. Pelvises shattering under their own bodies. They collapsed inward, fragile statues, hollowed out by betrayal. The greatest shock came years later, when those tombs were disturbed. When coffins were pried open and the world saw what lay inside, those corpses did not look like corpses. They looked like relics. They were still radioactive. She, and others like her, Edna Huss, Catherine Schaub, Keena MacDonald, Albina Larice, continued to testify from wheelchairs, from hospital beds, with crutches, splints, and fading breath. They described their jobs. The lip-pointing, the pain, the denials, the knowledge that they had been used, fed to the altar of progress. Dr. Harrison Martland, the doctor who first identified radium poisoning, examined the bones of the deceased dial painters. He found terrifyingly high concentrations of radioactivity. The dose, he realized, came simply from painting dials. Then he understood the horror. The radium had replaced the calcium in their bones, atom by atom, and now those atoms were decaying from within. It was as if the Grim Reaper had gone to art school, learned to paint dials with glowing bones, and then returned to collect his payment. The women were crumbling from the inside out, bones breaking, joints fusing, then fracturing again. And still, the U.S. Radium Company denied everything. They claimed the science wasn't settled. Grace Fryer, now the face of the battle, could no longer walk without assistance. Her spine was compressing from within. Finally, in 1928, the Radium Girls case reached national attention. But for most of the women, the victory was hollow. It is October 25, 1932. Eben Byers is dead. The press has a field day. The self-proclaimed lone wolf of Wall Street dies of radium-induced jaw rot and organ failure. Hundreds across the country have fallen victim to radium poisoning, lured in by false promises of health and beauty. In the end, it took Eben Byers, one of the richest men in America, to sound the alarm. Despite overwhelming evidence, corporate-sponsored scientists refused to testify. But the public was growing wary. The glow, once celebrated, now sent shivers down the spine. Soil samples showed elevated radiation levels decades later. In some cases, entire lots were deemed uninhabitable. Ottawa, Illinois faced similar horrors. The Radium Girls' light reached further than anyone expected. Their story began appearing in labor law textbooks, occupational health seminars, feminist history courses. For once, the world did not forget. Their names resurfaced, not just in legal documents, but in plays, documentaries, and books. Decades after their deaths, the first public memorials appeared. In 1980, a plaque was unveiled in Ottawa, Illinois, honoring the women who had worked there. Modest, easy to miss, but it marked a turning point. A formal acknowledgement of what had been denied for so long. These women were not expendable. They were not anonymous. They were pioneers. Even in death, they illuminated the truth. And perhaps, in some cosmic irony, their glow had done what no warning label could. It had revealed the danger, made it impossible to ignore, and dimmed the night sky of American progress just a little. Their bones still whisper. And finally, the world began to listen. Construction projects disturbed contaminated soil, rekindling fears among residents. Children played on grounds that had once housed radium operations. Schools and homes were built where luminous paint had spilled onto factory floors decades earlier. Eben Byers had consumed 1,400 bottles of Radither, a popular radium tonic. The slogan on the label promised, "A cure for the living dead." It wasn't an exaggeration. By the end of his life, he was one. But Byers was not the only victim. In 1932, the FDA seized 3,000 bottles of the deadly tonic. A year later, the company that produced it, the U.S. Radium Company, filed for bankruptcy. Radium behaves like a molecular saboteur. Once inside the body, it mimics calcium, infiltrating bones and emitting alpha particles for years, sometimes for decades. Its half-life is 1,600 years. In practical terms, this means the women who ingested it will die with it still inside them, barely weakened. The legal battles were over. The science had spoken. But something still lingered. Workers at radium processing plants were dying of radium-induced cancers. The glow was literally killing people, yet the industry fought back. Chemical companies spent millions on public relations campaigns. Scientists were paid to downplay the findings. Memos revealed a deliberate effort to minimize panic, not out of compassion, but out of fear. Not just fear of lawsuits, fear of losing control. The factories were gone. The billboards taken down. But the soil remained contaminated. The radium was not only in the ground, it was in the water, in the homes, in the schools. Residents were afraid to rebuild. Children could not play outside. Houses were abandoned. In some places, the radiation was so high that nothing could grow. Entire city blocks died. At Oak Ridge National Laboratory, scientists uncovered the terrible truth. But the science did not stop at the grave. Soil samples still showed elevated radiation levels. Decades later, years passed. The factories vanished. The U.S. radium facility in Orange was eventually demolished, but not before generations of workers and nearby residents had been exposed to lingering contamination. But the story doesn't end there. The Radium Girls never set out to change the world. They only wanted to do their jobs, to earn a living. They had no idea that their bones would one day rewrite history. The industrial boom had brought wealth, but it had also brought brutal exploitation. By the 1940s, protective gear, safety signage, and industrial hygiene departments began appearing in factories across the country. Health monitoring protocols were established. Scientific whistleblowers began to be heard. The workplace was no longer an invisible world, immune from scrutiny. It had become a battleground of ethics, of accountability. For women especially, the Radium Girls became a symbol, not just of suffering, but of agency. They spoke when they were told to be silent. They testified when their jaws were broken. They fought when they were expected to fade away. Their legacy was one of bodily autonomy, of the right to demand safety, truth, and respect, even from the most powerful institutions. Their names entered case law. Their stories entered labor history. Their pain carved a path for protections millions now take for granted. And yet, they remained largely unknown. History remembered wars, presidents, and inventors. But glowing girls with crumbling bones. That story was too sad. Too inconvenient. It flickered at the edge of memory, like a dim watch face forgotten in a drawer. If you were injured or poisoned on the job, the burden of proof was yours. And few had the strength, or the knowledge, to challenge corporate power. This is part 1 of a 2-part series. Subscribe for part 2, coming soon. The Radium Girls exposed the flaw in that system. Their suffering was too public, too grotesque, too radioactive to ignore. Lawmakers began to take notice. Pressure led to improved workers' compensation laws, particularly in Illinois and New Jersey. New regulations were drafted, requiring companies to investigate and disclose known hazards. The idea that a corporation could be held responsible for long-term harm caused by slow exposure began to enter legal precedent, something that had not existed before. For industry, it was terrifying. If companies could be sued for harm that manifested years later, then no business using dangerous materials was safe from future liability. And that meant money. A lot of it. Instead of openly opposing new protections, many companies shifted tactics. They invested in public relations, in corporate image building, in behind-the-scenes lobbying. Still, the Radium Girls had changed the battlefield. Their cases were cited in future lawsuits against asbestos companies, chemical manufacturers, and eventually big tobacco. The very concept of class action lawsuits for toxic exposure could trace a direct thread back to the quiet rooms where glowing bones were first examined by a skeptical doctor. This is the story of the forgotten women who glowed in the dark. Do you ever feel like your problems are being ignored? Like nobody cares what you have to say? The Radium Girls felt that every day. They were young, working-class women, many with little education, no political voice, and few financial resources. Their stories began in quiet desperation, and ended with whispered verdicts in courtrooms where men in suits weighed justice against cost and convenience. And yet, despite the overwhelming imbalance, their cases changed everything. What began as a handful of wrongful death suits in the 1920s would ripple through decades, reshaping labor law, corporate liability, and worker protections across the United States and beyond. Before their fight, companies had almost no legal obligation to ensure the long-term safety of their workers. But there was another, quieter effect, one that reached into the lives of every worker. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll uncover the truth behind the mysterious illness that haunted these women and the groundbreaking legal battles that followed. They're not here anymore. Almost none of them. But what if they were? What if they walked among us right now, talking, laughing? They were artists. Their medium was radium. Their canvas, anything that would hold still, including themselves. They painted their nails, their teeth, their faces. They wore it like perfume. They ate it with their lunches, unaware they were swallowing their future. What if they removed their gloves, and we saw that their hands glowed, not with jewelry or ink, but with radium? Their corpses, locked in a decaying embrace with an element that should never have touched them, are still active. Still dangerous. They are not just history. They are a warning. They are light. And some lights never go out. Perhaps, somewhere deep underground, if you listen closely, you'll hear them. Not screaming. Not crying. But whispering. We were here. We were bright. You knew. Would we notice? Would we care? Or would we keep talking, eating, smiling, unaware that every breath we share might be our last? More than a century ago, hundreds of women sat at tables, dipping brushes into paint, painting dials, watches, clock hands that still tick today. Their story is almost forgotten. The companies are gone. The factories dismantled. The ground cleared and sold as safe. But the poison was invisible, insidious. A seductive glow that seemed like magic, a miracle. The power to heal, to help, to give light in the darkness. How could they have known? Most didn't die right away. Some lived long enough to see their teeth rot. Some miscarried again and again, watching their hopes died. Others disappeared, lost in the paperwork of a bygone era, their names and faces fading with each passing decade. But what if the ground remembers? What if the soil in New Jersey and Illinois still holds their ghosts? What if they are here, in the dirt, in the silence, in the spaces between the houses and schools and playgrounds? What if they are here in the cancer clusters and birth defects? In the rashes, the fevers, the unexplained illnesses that haunt the residents of towns like Ottawa and Orange? What if we just can't hear them? What if we could dig them up, dust them off, and ask, "Why? Why did you let them do this to you? Why didn't you speak up? Why didn't you fight?" The truth is, they did fight. But what if they haven't faded? What if they're still here, watching, waiting, whispering to the trees and the birds, to the cars and the crowds? Scientists estimate that the bones of the Radium Girls will remain radioactive for thousands of years, longer than any of us will live. Longer than the countries that killed them. So when a dial glows in the dark, when luminous paint catches your eye, when progress promises wonders without cost, remember the girls who glowed and died for it.